Hello everyone, today we talk about the Utraquist priests in the Hussite armies for our historical military units series that will encompass, as you understand, more broadly other, cultural questions deeply connected, however, with the moral forces that as Clausewitzians we know being essentially the dominating factor in war. And as you know, probably I also made several videos at this point about Hussite warfare in general, and then more specifically with the Battle of Malashov, and discussed Hussite warfare also in other videos here and there, stressing in many ways the, in fact, moral, spiritual dimension in the causes, right, of Hussite success as a dominating factor in explaining the Hussite success, right? Because much of the, let's say, interest that has been historiographically given to the Hussites in, say, contemporary historiography has often come from kind of sensationalistic and kind of positivistic, modernistic bias towards what Hussite tactics were from a strictly technical point of view, right? Stressing, for example, the important place that the Hussites would have had in the, let's say, in fact, the modernization of warfare, if anything, as armies of commoners, largely at least, capable of defeating the knightly elite of the Crusaders sent against them, and especially stressing the importance of the wagon fort from a tactical point of view and of its employment. And the truth being that in many ways there is, of course, a political and strategic context that made the thing in particular, and that seemingly has been neglected in dimensioning in a diachronic and comparative way the actual deal of Hussite warfare, and that in my opinion was not particularly advanced at all, frankly, and nor it can be imputed to the a specific, modernization thought or expansion of military art towards. Also because Hussite tactics fundamentally were not just wouldn't basically leave a trace, because also their military parabola exhausted itself fundamentally just in a couple of decades, if not less, and but especially because it was not an innovative thing, right? The same Wagenburg was, pretty common thing in all armies, and especially in the ones of Central Eastern Europe that resented more of steppes warfare, but in general, right? And nor it represents anything particularly advanced for the warfare of the time, right? Had the Hussite armies fought, I don't know, on the French or Italian battlefields, probably, just the higher amount of artillery that was present there would have probably taken out the Wagenburgs in ways that would have probably not made us even hear about the Hussites and so widely in popular culture. But I actually have a positive bias towards their military capacity and effectiveness, because instead I look not much towards their political or religious point, frankly, because the main movement kind of was equally seen in this progressistic, modernistic way as kind of a prodrome of the Reformation, with which surely had important points in common, properly in terms also of the spread of not again of just military techniques, because many, especially the Taborites, the most extremistic side, as you know, dispersed in Germany and Poland, and probably seeding the same ferments of the Reformation in some part, doctrinally, theologically, etc. Because I believe that in fact their strength was essentially a spiritual one, a moral one, and very often also a fanatic one, right? To the point that naturally should be explained in a sense. Some give culturalist explanation, saying that Bohemians have a kind of a mystic background just in spirituality, and they were more sensitive to this kind of issues at the time. In many ways, Hussitism is a very complex and complicated affair. I made a video last year about the the Bohemian Diets during the like Hussite times, so probably the Hussite government. And we've seen that naturally the picture was not just very variegated and unstable, and still the nobility, of course, maintained essentially the first place in the broader balance, but also the entire Hussite experience was essentially a calamitous disaster of magnitudinal scale for Bohemia, which literally collapsed, losing 1/3 of its inhabitants, having been a land that up to that point had actually flourished importantly under the Luxembourgs, etc. This is not to say that, of course, there weren't issues let's say deriving exactly from the previous time, but in a sense, let's say revolts, let's say oppression, authoritarian governments, and this kind of resistance to them were the normal dichotomy of any era, arguably. And so the way it took form in the case of the Hussites naturally reflects the specific nature of that Central European region, the political balances. And again, it's something that we cannot digress on, and I hope to make lots of videos more on. But the same tactical effectiveness and the extraordinary victories that the Hussites achieved, again, as many armies in history, without recurring to a specific technology and or tactics, about which we also know very few, frankly, because the way they used wagon forces in a defensive fashion, for example, it's rather kind of obvious. It was being functionalized dramatically, given also the strategically offensive capacities of the Hussite, as you know, in Hungary, even in Germany, etc. But they reflect they're not the aim, right, and the decisive mean. They reflect just the purpose and the functionalization of this army, the gradual professionalization, because the early Hussite armies weren't like the last ones, and therefore also kind of I would say still a normal type of a normal military development, considering the basis, right? At this time, European warfare is dramatically homogeneous, right? Especially Western, Central Europe basically have the same tactics. The 15th century is even in the easternmost areas of Mittel Europa, kind of the full westernization, probably, of warfare. So again, naturally, every land is different and it declines this in different ways, but the core is fundamentally the same. So the illusion that there was something technically, or even worse, technologically edgy to the point of conferring to Hussites this kind of tactical superiority, frankly, is a myth that should be debunked basically for any kind of army, and restoring the actual merit that the Hussites had, militarily speaking, to, in fact, counter, as you know, even much larger armies than theirs, and or, however, much more, actually technically superior to them, by the way, and succeeding in that series of striking victories that they achieved. So today we're not going to explain how that happened, because I made already a video about Hussite tactics specifically, and we will keep looking at various battles. But we focus on this unit of the Utraquist Hussite priest, which is, again, maybe the epiphenomenal, in fact, pinnacle of the tip of an iceberg, let's say, of the broader force that was supporting the Utraquist movement. So Utraquist, sometimes it's also synonymous with Hussites altogether, because it was essentially it's a name that derives from the principal religious demand of the Hussites, which was that laymen as well as priests should receive communion, famously enough, under both kinds. In Latin, sub utraque specie. So uterque, utraque, utrunque means simply both. So they were stressing that in this case, like the followers of Jan Hus in the vest of priests had been to share the consecrated wine with the congregation, right, thus giving them communion in both kinds, and this had been condemned roundly by the Council of Constance, so it had become a bit the touchstone for expressing support for whose views that was burned at the stake by the Roman Catholic Church, and triggering therefore the revolt of the Hussites that still was connected to other issues. The rule under canon law that the congregation took Holy Communion during the celebration Mass, receiving only the consecrated bread, with the clergy alone partaking of the wine, was the normality at the time. But as you know, the Hussites, as well as Wycliffe, Ball, etc., at this point are the precursors of much of the instances, in fact, of the Reformation, as we were saying before. And as you know, the Hussites went on. We were just talking about it the other day when looking at the history of the Margravate of Moravia, right, in Bohemia, in the Kingdom of Bohemia. Given that this was mostly a Bohemian movement, and the Moravians, especially given that were led by the nobility at some point, and that initially had presented instances themselves in favor of Hus, mostly sided with the Pope and with the Catholic crusaders that were sent, and opened the gates to the kingdom. In fact, to the Luxembourgs, to the Hungarians, in that case, and their allies. So the symbology behind the chalice specifically, as a symbol of the movement for the wine communion, was crucial. It is to be found pretty much in all over the Hussite iconography, and that's the most specific, properly Utraquist symbol. And priests were very important, naturally, in what was taking the form of a political movement based on a heresy, right, on a choice within the same Christian ritual. By the way, that the Hussites also polemicized with, for example, with Wycliffe. There was not like a broader shared kind of European view on this, right? These movements were again all stemming from specific situations that were pretty much concerned about themselves rather than the entirety of the system. But of course, the universalistic views of the time were also quite relevant in making of this struggle, in fact, an ecumenic issue, right, in a eschatological, also apocalyptic sense. And priests, their preaching, in fact, had a major impact, notoriously, in the Hussite movement. And the reason why we talk about it today in a military history video is that they figured prominently in Hussite armies. Also, this is not really a novelty. Like, all medieval armies actually had priests that were to communicate the troops before the battle, officiating mass, giving the anointing of the dying on the battlefield, etc. And also partaking combat, which was actually an issue which was discussed, as we will see now, because it was not normal for priests to take up arms. This, killing was just considered a sin in general. But this priest actually had a huge, not just strictly moral impact on properly the battles, and sometimes during the Hussite revolt, also in the cities, as we'll see now, leading men, right, to revolt, etc. But in fact, properly in a tactical sense, right, given this, properly deciding, even commanding the military operations, being present, in infusing this spirit in the revolts. And naturally, this priesthood was very heterogeneous, as we'll see now, because of many reasons. And some have wanted to see, at least in these individuals, also the possible vehicles intellectually of some specific strategic culture that at that point would have been derived essentially from the reading of Vegetius' Epitome Rei Militaris. Also about this, there is actually a passage in one of the contemporary sources that attributes to the Hussites properly an ability in combat because of having, remembered and reenacted, in a sense, the deeds of the ancients during their art of war. But this was a kind of a literary topos that during the Middle Ages was often expressed, if anything, because the medievals were literally obsessed with the deeds of the Greeks and the Romans, and there was basically no other model to compare, if not some great commanders of the same rulers rather of the medieval times that were essentially considered also, in fact, very much under a Christian light rather than a strictly military one at some point. But the idea of faculty of command was surely sought after in general by any leader. In any case, I have expressed my opinion on the actually vexata question of this kind of recovery of ancient military wisdom through Vegetius. By his own admission, says that he basically didn't understand anything about war because he was really not into the thing, and he was just idealizing, in a sense, in his own. Some things are correct, that he says are very useful and important and concrete and real and coherent, but others are just, and it was not properly the literary task of that specific genre to provide with a military knowledge that still in Hussite times, in late medieval Europe, was provided by sheer experience, right? You had to wait the 16th century, we talked about this often, for having properly military manuals that were at least intentionally designed at the beginning to provide with some positive applicational capacity to the same precepts, but it's not until von Clausewitz that the entire thing is clarified, and also explaining how this would happen, and still practice and experience were the first thing, right? Medieval commanders didn't write military treatises because, or even when they wrote them, they said, you can easily see that it's a literary topos in many ways. Didn't need to learn from books how to fight, right? How to lead armies, how to drill, etc. Because it was just like war was waged so often, and it was done in ways that were so kind of unknown within the the milieus that were in charge of that fundamentally there was not really much to understand in a theoretical sense that you couldn't make sense of in terms of how with the enormous difficulty and definitely skills that still command required, which were enormous, and medieval art of war was actually extremely refined and advanced and developed, especially at this time, surely beyond also the ancient one. But we need to think again as moderns, as contemporaries, to pretend that without manuals you can't do things. The world up to 100 years ago was completely the other way around. Most people were just practically oriented. Theory was not needed, right? It was not a matter of being stupid or intelligent. It was just that the world, right, for the scale, for the dynamics of its culture, phenomena, etc., did not require that, right? It's just today we are forgetting in many ways how that was, because again nobody really teaches us. But this idea that Vegetius, it was factually the only military manual read in Western Europe during the Middle Ages from the past, but also in many, not the present, but let's say it was something more complete, at least in a treaty form, was was just again a cherry on top on a base of knowledge that commanders already had, and that by getting exactly because they already knew the whole thing, they wanted to kind of see if there could be some systematization of that thought, and so they had this source that we know was read even in in Carolingian times. Some dukes, counts, in the frontiers would read this thing, right? But we cannot expect them, to be nor essentially schooled in war by this, nor that warfare, and this is especially the point, was actually meaningfully influenced by Vegetzius, right? Which would have not been like, first of all, there were different times, different warfare, etc. Certain things, yes, were kind of similar, but again, this can't maybe digress too much because it's getting too long and boring, but there are specific concrete reasons why we actually also know that it would have not made sense of kind of enforcing that application, which factually never happened, right? It's not that even when, I don't know, the Renaissance commanders were trying to simulate the Macedonian phalanx and the Roman legion, actual warfare ever came to mirror that or to come closer to that out of the dynamics that were just forming on the field. It wasn't the thing, right? It had never been historically, it never was, right? So this is unfortunately, however, a problem. And there's even a modern authority that is stressing that Jan Uska would have, battlefield tactics would have derived from the epitome, but it's a complete speculation and doesn't find any demonstration. If anything, because if you study the tactics, there is either no way properly of demonstrating that, or simply the tactics were something else. So I know this better because I had to criticize in my work as well some hypotheses were done for my specific time and place of research in late medieval times, and I can assure you that has nothing to do with that. But still, you see historiographers, scholars that make this hypothesis, trying to see, oh look, Vegetzius said this thing, and deploying troops on the flank here, and here it happened to look, so maybe it was Vegetzius. Why should it be even if it was, if you realize if you studied again the entirety of battles of that period and how they actually fought, you realize that it was an homogeneity that simply had nothing to do with the broader thing, and very often also sources can be misleading, especially when they were trying to write treatises at the time. I found something interesting about Theodore Palaiologos of Montferrat that wrote an interesting manual that essentially mixes his Byzantine treatise background that, as you know, was kind of quite ideal in classicizing, with his northwestern Italian warfare, and that unfortunately we have only in a French translation of the 15th century. This was an early 14th century work, and we just have from the French translation. It's quite interesting, but it just takes to read it to see that it was kind of an ideal thing. It was just an exercise, or just a show of of culture, of diction, of logic, of reason, but it simply didn't have to do with the actual military practice, or even when it had it was something that are pretty normal, right? The unity of rank, of the lines of units, of formation, certain specific tricks, cares, etc. But again, something is also pretty universal. So I wouldn't attribute personally to this Hussite priests, in spite, I'm sure among them there were, in an elite of them were surely very cultured people who surely had read Vegetzius and surely would have talked about it, even in the bivouacs, to the commanders, to the troops. But they would have not had an impact as we intended today, because they were simply not meant to, and they were not meant for anybody right at the time, nor later, nor before. But what actually is being instead dramatically underestimated about the priest's contribution is their actual ideological capacity, right? The same symbolisms are very interesting. There is a manuscript, you can see it here, but it's quite famous, depicting a figure of a priest. This is from a manuscript. I think it's stored at the British Library. It has an illumination we're discussing dating from 1437, 1450. And there is famously Uska at the head of a column of Hussite infantry, while he's on horseback. And there is a priest fundamentally walking in front of the column, and in front of Uska, or not, let me check. Yes, in front of everyone, right? So, because this was the absolute point, right? The ecumenic value that the Hussite cause was championing in their view. And this guy is wearing a white mantle over a brown cassock, plus black shoes. Here I'm not aware of a specific Hussite clothing, because also there were kind of different groups within it. Some of them were very poor, frankly. But surely there was a kind of a way of distinguishing themselves from the other Catholic priests, but this could be kind of an example of how maybe a Hussite priest, like dressed well, at least could have looked. We know, for example, that Prokop the Great was Uska's not immediate but fundamentally most famous and important successor after, in fact, the former's death. Differed in clothing from the other Hussite high churchmen, who still dressed like other Catholic priests, right? While he would officiate in the clothes which he habitually wore instead. It was a coat, of course, thick cloth, according to the sources. Also considered that Prokop, as many priests of the Utraquist church, was a married man, for example. And there were this other kind of... Also, every church in Europe had kind of its own differences, in spite of the, Western Christendom ritual homogeneity in practice, and these movements were also kind of bringing further these differences, especially in most peripheral areas of Europe, the least developed in a way. But the most important symbol here that we're also displaying in the pictures is a gold monstrance with a glass or crystal relic case at its center. And most of the times there was a host, right? And you see it had the sun rays around in gold, and naturally representing the splendor of the Eucharist that for the, under both kinds was partaken by the Hussites in the Holy Communion. So this was a major symbol that figures prominently in at least an important amount of sources. This one mostly are essentially illuminations, and that was in fact, is kind of iconically reused also in modern art depicting the Hussites and so on. These were their battle banner, in a sense, together with the chalice, right? So completing effectively the both species, right? And regarding the participation of priests in combat, there were many disputations among the same Utraquist priesthood, right? And Prokop the Great, according to the most reliable accounts at least, took no part for this reason in the battles at which he was present. He was a very gifted military commander. So in this he differed from Uska, that was just a layman. And this in all the generals of the period too, with the exception of King Sigismund of Luxembourg. And still, this was a time in which kings preferred to just be in the rear, to command better, to risk less. This was, say, the threshold of the modern age in that regard. But still, actually, it was their duty at least to be militarily effective, also as individual fighter. This great age of tournaments, of military orders, and so on. So it was still actually a very important thing, at least in this context. King Sigismund distinguished himself. And it's only on the day of the Battle of Lipany that, as you know, was the defeat of the Taborite movement. It was the most fanatic fringe that went on fighting, differently from the Calixtines that were kind of the most moderate fringe of the Hussites, that on that battle fought, in fact, against the Taborites together with Catholic forces in the so-called Bohemian League, and which was the last day of Prokop's life, that we find him, in fact, joining in the battle, right, and being killed. And he seems to have realized at that point the difficulty of such an ambiguous position, and the credentials which he took with him to Basel, the Council of Basel, describe him at least as, quote, Procopius exercitum taboritarum in spiritualibus rector. So he was kind of the holder, so the pillar in many ways, of the within the spiritual matters, very spiritual matters of the army of the Taborites. So of course many other priests would actually take up arms, and being many, right, even in there, and these were people, as we'll see now, that had been fundamentally also deprived of their offices, because initially since February 1419, King Wenceslas IV of Bohemia had taken this dangerous step of ejecting the Utraquists from all the 3 churches of Prague, where the revolt essentially broke out. And this episode, this first reaction, and while some Hussite priests that feared to be killed in that instance left the capital, strengthening, by the way, the movement in towns elsewhere in Bohemia, especially in the south, was the hotbed of the Hussite, the nest, let's say, of Hussite rebellion. But others took more decisive action within the capital itself. In fact, one of the most famous priests of the Hussite movement was the one who led the revolutionaries in this instance in Prague, named Jan Zelivsky. It's not really a kind of a candid figure. On July the 30th, 1419, that would remain an important date in European history, if anything, also for a double that happened 200 years later. While preaching a sermon to one of his usual crowded services, fiercely attacking the new city council and its oppressive measures against the Hussites, Jan Zelivsky spirited the crowd, describing King Wenceslas IV as the dragon of the apocalypse. They had to take him out fundamentally. So after the mass, he himself took the sacred host. So you see that this thing recurs of the host properly in the forefront as the military banner faction, from his church, and led a protest march, which was joined actually by many armed men. The angry crowd made its way to the town hall in the new town, so at the northern end of Prague's cattle market. And at this point was a negotiation between the leaders of this procession, shouting up to the town councillors that were talking to them instead from an upstairs window of the town hall. And initially, there was a test of the situation, but when the councillors refused to discuss the release of the Hussite prisoners, the crowd kind of lost it, and it was claimed that someone had thrown a stone from the window. Some said at the sacred host, others said hitting the head of Jan Zelivsky. In any case, the enraged mob forced the door and broke the doors of the town hall, burst in, seized the councillors, and threw them from the windows onto the spear points of the armed Hussites standing below, and beheaded some of them. It was a pretty gory thing. These murders came to be defined as the first defenestration of Prague, right? Literally meaning, throwing somebody defenestrat out of the window in Latin. So again, this would echo the, in 16, the beginning of the 30 Years' War, as in another not so different context, in a sense, at least for the same dynamic. There is another anecdote about the 17th century one, but it's not important now. And this was a huge affront to the king, Wenceslas IV, who allegedly, died of a stroke after having rode like a lion against the Hussites as a consequence of this incident. And at that point, his brother Sigismund stepped in. He was essentially the one responsible for having put Jan Hus to death, and so he seized this opportunity for claiming the crown of Bohemia for himself. And this marked essentially the beginning of the Hussite Wars. And so you see here the centrality of Jan Zelivsky, right, as an agitator, as a preacher, as an ideologue, and so on. And these priests had a specific purpose, right? They would not just be armed, presumably themselves within the crowd, right? Maybe with simple weapons, like it could be wood axes, or also that the Hussites are famous for specific traumatic weapons like flails, etc. And we don't discuss how they use them, but pretty much like anybody else, that matter. Just the combination with the wagon force has spread some speculation about that. And the priests were, however, properly tasked with the duty of preaching, right, by the same Hussite military commanders. When Uska replied to the burghers of Domaslice in 1424 that were asking him for help and what they had to do to organize their community against the enemies, among the various issues, Uska wrote, quote, "Therefore instruct your priests that they may, when preaching, call the people to arms against Antichrist, against the Antichrist." There are many different type of priests in the Hussite movement, some of them also historians. For example, Nicholas of Pelhřimov, that deserves a special mention for his writings by Taborite divines, which have been preserved and that are important source for the period. This is known as Chronicon Continens Causam Sacerdotum Taboriensium, right? And otherwise, we also lack a dramatic documentation about the Hussite movement itself. In fact, we were noticing it even in the battle videos that do not really clarify much, right? The very, many accounts are very simple, right? These were areas of Europe where, frankly, but also because of the background of these people that were often overlapping probably with the revolutionary mob, in a sense, wouldn't have much of a cultural background after all, right? So why would the Jesuits, as we were saying before, would influence them more than, say, Sigismund's Crusaders? I don't think that it's just because of the tactical success, Frank. And again, it's an overstatement of the Jesuits' impact in medieval warfare, and more than that, was an understatement of the Hussite driving force, right? And there are other accidents. For example, just this other name, Ambrož Hradečky, who on November the 4th, 1420, essentially exhorted the people to attack the royal castle on the Hradzany hill in Kralove Hradec. That would be Königgrätz, by the way. Was another military important name, but 400 years later. And some, especially Ambrož, was part of the so-called Orebite community coming from the east of Bohemia, and some of these individuals were literally nuts, right? They were some of the most uncompromising, fanatic, violent individuals you could find. Martin Uska, for example, is another name that probably at the time was considered by some, as a radical leader, one worth following. But in a more enlightened age, he would have found a better place in a mental asylum, frankly. But this made also the thing, because again, you cannot quite understand the Hussite success given other preconditions, but through this brutally and radically, overflowing motivation that they had, sometimes was dictated literally by the threat of annihilation, but their motives that had made them withstand also the royal power, the imperial power, the papal power, the crusades, etc., was evidently deriving from a specific, zeitgeist that surely fits pretty much the turbulent, kind of dark moments of those times. Right? You speak of the Dark Ages like the beginning of the Middle Ages, but the 15th century was objectively very dark in many ways, exactly considering 1/3 of Bohemian population wiped out in the process of these. And the Hussites were, also the non-radical fringe were often quite gentle to the point of, simply massacring, especially the priests and monks that opposed their cause. Usually women and children would be spared, but this doesn't mean much when you basically massacre their husbands and fathers, and you destroy their houses and sack them. So some of the most horrifying things than you can imagine. Definitely many women also had less fortunate, and children, by the way, less fortunate stories, let's say. Great part of this zealot fanatism surely derived from, rather than a classical military knowledge of classical military trees, is actually from the quite abundantly spot-on military content of the Old Testament, right? Also from the same apocalyptic preaching. Some of the names we have listed, Zelivsky, Hradetsky, and others. And yes, Hussite victories owed largely to this kind of atmosphere, this climate, this ideology was formed within these people. And we can assert that such people were also fully convinced of the justice and worthiness of their cause, right? There was an episode, some of these are anecdotes, but of a Taborite woman who, when urged to take part in a temporary retreat during the Battle of Bitkov Hill, said, quote, "A true Christian must never retire before the Antichrist." This is another note because medieval armies, as you know, were often accompanied by a settler train. There were merchants, prostitutes, just people kind of that were in for the loot, that would follow the army for hoping to get part of the spoils of war. So not really particularly, highly, located individuals from a social point of view. But it is true that the Hussite movement, famously enough, took the form also of a broader communitarian experience. There were many, for example, that also kind of hated each other. For example, the Adamites were famous apparently for their orgies that were criticized by many in the same most extremistic movements. The same Taborites take the name after the actually pretty beautiful town of Tabor. If you visit Czech Republic, it's pretty interesting. And so behind this, there is also an important demic component that made up the Hussite armies that were very often, as you know, on the run because they were outlawed. They were often cornered and chased by larger armies, greater powers, but could also pass on the offensive, but they were often on the move. Thanks also to their wagon force that probably also in this have been exaggerated because, yes, you have a wagon, but, It's not that everything is in a wagon, and the armies traveled, pretty much at the same speed. And if you even leave someone behind, that's not a positive thing strategically or tactically when you have to fight. So rather, the wagons were used cleverly in this kind of fortress fashion that the Hussites, for obvious reasons of apparently fact of tactical inferiority, would have to entrench in defense, which means that you don't have the offensive capacity that anybody has to exploit, right? It's a bit like the English armies of the 100 Years' War. Like the fact that they fought dismounted, it's not much, like it's not an advantage or something that they had doctrinally, ingrained just because, the English fought like that. But very often because they were also facing much larger enemy forces, and it would have not been particularly, considered to especially in cavalry charges. That is what made up still the warfare, the decisive part of the fight. So again, never think there is a magic trick, a special, secret tactic that others hadn't found out. Oh my God, or deep, that deep, sophistication of the art of war that just the Hussites had, and there's none of that. The only thing that matters in war, arguably, is how much you want to rip the guts out of the person in front of you. It doesn't even matter how armed you are, right? This is the forever ongoing illusion of modern people that are obsessed in modern reconstructionism, in HEMA, in reenactment, with which kind of weapon, right? Which is best or worse? What do you even realize? Have you ever even reconstructed a medieval battle from the actual accounts, right? Did you realize that it doesn't stop to a single guy, right? Do you realize that warfare is something complex that you have to specifically study, again, kind of very intensive, systemic way to understand it, not, pretending to speculate by wearing an armor, right? This is a big issue with the medievalist community. I don't know how many of you partake that, because I see that some of you are reenactors, some of you are HEMAists and so on, but I also made videos about this, frankly explaining a bit what I think about that. But again, historiography did not help, right? Fitting the placing at least the Hussite warfare and tactics in the great advancements of infantry of the late Middle Ages, frankly, I don't know, it's still infantry, but it's, it doesn't compare with what was happening actually in other countries at the same time. It was actually something a bit more systemic and advanced, right? Entrenching in a Wagenburg is can't be as effective as you can, but again, lucky the Bohemians that there wasn't much structurally artillery around in that specific areas where they operated, in those theaters, because things would have, in other areas of Europe, would have gone very different, right? And there was practically no trace they left in that regard. But this is me kind of annoying you with my rants and complaints about how, the end of the world is near and everybody has lost their mind, which is, I think, pretty historically spot on as a consideration. But I will never stop saying it, because again, it doesn't take out at all the Hussite merit, militarily speaking. It can't, right? It can't be erased. It's just exactly giving them the merit they deserve, in that sense, that should make you go a bit more far, which apparently has become too demanding in a conceptual, theoretical sense. And I think that just the average layman can step in the matter and say, well, it's just how I think I would like it to be, right? And not much else. Well, when you realize that everybody thinks the same from that standpoint, and when you study the sources and it's not like the case, and when that there's no evidence of that, and when you think that this is fundamentally, start thinking that this may be because nobody reads the sources, well, at that point you don't even need to be an expert either to come to that conclusion. But anyhow, I like sometimes to make these videos about more exotic things that you wouldn't expect, right? You make a video about, I don't know even how long it lasted, because they're all different chunks that I put together afterwards. But also Hussite priests had their relevance in the history of warfare, and as historical military units figure in the relative Schwerpunkt, in the dedicated Schwerpunkt playlist. So for today I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.